All right, everybody. So welcome to our November 2023 Lunch and Learn about conflict resolution. And I'm really, really excited about this topic because it does apply to kind of all of our cases, regardless of where we are. So I'm going to turn it over directly to CASA Leann Moore and have her introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leann Moore. I am Newcastle County CASA. I think I just came up on my 8 years. I think something around there. I work full-time at the University of Delaware in the provost's office, but I previously worked in the conflict resolution department. So I'm going to be giving you kind of a primer on some alternative dispute resolution techniques, but specifically focusing in on facilitation and dealing with difficult dynamics or difficult personalities. So I dropped in the chat a couple handouts as well as the PDF of the slides. I also sent them to Lauren like 2 seconds ago. So if you came in a little late and you don't see them in the chat or they're not downloading for you, Lauren will get them out ahead of time. But not ahead of time. She was supposed to, but then I failed on that. So sorry, everyone. So we're going to just jump right in. Maybe. There we go. Everyone can see that. We're good to go. Okay. So first and foremost, if it's not clear, we're going to be talking a lot about conflict today, but what's the first word or first couple words that jump to your mind when you hear the word conflict? Just come off mute and shout it out. Fighting. Confrontation. Disagreement. Okay.
Anger.
All true. So I heard a lot of like not necessarily great words in there, maybe something with negative connotations. Most people don't love conflict. It's not something that they, enjoy. Today we'll talk a little bit about also your conflict default and based on your personality, what kind of conflict manager you are. But the other thing to keep in mind is that conflict is maybe it's just a little bit like of an annoyance. Maybe it's a difference of opinions. Maybe it's a little bit bigger than that. And it's about inequality or power dynamics. Again, disagreement, we heard that. Or it's a competition between competing parties, people. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you do not have a conflict if there is not emotion attached to it. So in our cases, emotion is throughout, right? When you're talking about someone's kids, when you're talking about kids in general, who might have difficulty as an underdeveloped brain regulating emotions. Emotions are riddled throughout our CASA cases. So inherently in cases, we're going to have a good amount of conflict. So we deal with that external conflict, but we also deal, probably, at least I do, with a lot of internal conflict about what I think is best versus maybe what's best for the kids, or would I do things differently? So there's that external and internal conflict going on at all times. So today we're just going to kind of go through some tips and tricks for dealing probably more with the external conflict than the internal, but I want to make sure that throughout this presentation, depending on where you are personally in your life, regardless of CASA, how you handle different conflict situations is going to be reliant on what's going on in your life. And that's also true for all the folks in our cases. So it's important to be able to look in the mirror, recognize where we are so that we are in the best space to deal with the conflict that we come upon. So if something important is threatened, at the end of the day, if something important to you is threatened, you're going to have a conflict. So keep in mind that emotion aspect as we go through. So first and foremost, facilitation versus mediation. Both facilitation and mediation are ADR, alternative dispute resolution techniques. Ultimately, alternative dispute resolution just means you're trying to resolve something without going to court. we are all in court, right, as a part of a CASA case. But when you're dealing with conflict in the day-to-day, you don't want to ideally have to bring up everything in court. You don't want to have the judge to have to rule on things and wait 3, 5, 6 months sometimes to get that resolution. So having facilitation and mediation techniques for that day-to-day can be very helpful in our cases. So first, facilitation, which is really what we're going to be focusing on today, but I want to give you a primer of both facilitation and mediation. Facilitation is a good facilitator has to have all of these 10 things and probably more, but the ones I want to draw your attention to are unbiased, that number one, and flexible. So unbiased, we are always trying to represent the needs and the best interests of our kiddos or youth in care. However, when we're dealing with maybe a team meeting where maybe the foster parents are there, the biological parents are there, school officials are there, maybe DFS is there, there's so many different perspectives at the table. And oftentimes, in my experience at least, there's no very clear facilitator and people start to talk in circles. So even though in that situation I have an opinion, I try and take on a somewhat unbiased approach to try and let everyone have a say. So ideally, if you're a facilitator, you're not involved in the conflict at hand or the decisions being made. But in our cases, we have a role to play. We have an opinion that needs to be brought forward. But oftentimes I think it's people look to us to be that kind of facilitator to make sure every perspective is heard. And I think that's part of our responsibility as CASAs is to hear every perspective. So when I'm talking about unbiased in this situation as a CASA, it doesn't necessarily mean I don't have an opinion, but it means that I'm going to hear everything. So that goes to that listening, active listening as well. And then finally, flexible. Oftentimes I hear that, this is the only way. The only thing I want is when I do IEP meetings, especially I'm also an education surrogate parent, the only thing we want is a one-on-one aid for our child. Well, are there other ways to get to a solution except that one way? So being able to keep an open mind as a facilitator in a meeting is extremely important. So all of these 10 things are very important. We don't have time to go through all of them, but I wanted to draw specific attention to that. So facilitator can be anytime, any place, anywhere. If you're using these skills in order to try and come to a resolution or a decision within a group of people that has a lot of different perspectives, you're a facilitator. Alternatively, you are trying to manage and guide this group of people to a path forward. I think oftentimes without this type of role in a group setting, especially in a CASA team meeting, there isn't a resolution at all. Like we don't make a decision, or only a couple voices are heard versus hearing a lot of different ideas and brainstorming. So facilitation, there's a lot of trainings out there. If you're interested in really diving into facilitation more, I am happy to provide resources, but this is an entire practice. There are facilitators and that's what they do as a full-time. There's also resources in Delaware, specifically when talking about education or healthcare decisions, where if you feel that the team is not able to move forward or come to a decision where everyone's being heard, there are free services for that in the education and healthcare systems as a resource. Mediation is different than facilitation. Mediation is around a specific issue. So it's safe, it's confidential, and it's voluntary. Oftentimes we hear of mediation in custody cases, having to go to mediation in the courthouse. Mediation in alternative dispute resolution is not what our courts do because if it's court mandated mediation, it's not the mediation I'm talking about. Mediation is when an outside person comes in to try and help you come to a decision solution in writing but everyone that's at that table for that conversation has voluntarily agreed to be there. So that's very different than what we're talking about. The distinct differences between facilitator and mediator is a mediator never can have a say or have a decision-making power, whereas a facilitator sometimes can. A mediator is definitely that outside neutral party, whereas a facilitator ideally is, but doesn't necessarily have to be. And mediation takes place around a specific issue in a specific place and time, and you leave with a very clear-cut, written agreement. So it's a much more formal process than facilitation. Today, we're going to talk all about facilitation from here on in, but I wanted to make sure we drew those distinctions between facilitation and mediation, especially in the court system. We hear the word mediation, but that's not necessarily what a lot of other people use as the definition for mediation. Just want to pause real quick if anyone has any burning questions about facilitation or mediation. Okay. So now we're really going to dive into the skills of communicating in a conflict. So the number one thing you need when there's a conflict going on, which is also probably the hardest thing, is active listening. We also want to have the skills of being able to summarize for ourselves and our own emotions and desires, but also for other folks. Again, conflict, if there is a conflict in someone's life, there is an emotion involved. And if you do not acknowledge those emotions, it's very, very hard, sometimes impossible, to move forward towards an agreement or towards a next step. And then finally, assertive speaking. In my base core of Leann, struggle with assertive speaking. I'm definitely a people pleaser, but assertive speaking is a necessary skill in order to deal with conflict in an appropriate and sustainable way where you're not just always giving in. So first, assertive speaking, the easiest way to start practicing this, and probably more in your personal life than starting right away in a CASA case, is using I statements. So the best way is to say, you know, I feel disrespected when whatever happened. So I use this with my partner all the time, where I feel very frustrated when you don't clean up after yourself, because that makes me feel like you don't value my time because I then have to do it. It's a silly example, but if you're talking about a CASA case, right, when what do you think is best, right? I feel termination of parental rights is the best goal for this child because, and then you list it. We're comfortable doing that, hopefully, or ideally, in court, but can we use those same skills when it's a one-on-one conversation with the parent or the foster parent or the teachers or the DFS worker? In terms of active listening, oftentimes people say they're listening, but they're not actively listening. And the best way to describe listening versus active listening is listening to respond. Active listening is listening to understand. So when I am upset about something, usually when there's a conflict, I'm frustrated or angry or sad, it's very hard to take a step back and not just be thinking about what I want to say. Rather, it's what you should be doing is listening to why the other person is feeling that way so that you can move forward. So the way you do that is by getting to the bottom of positions versus interest. So a position is what comes out immediately. So that's the top part of that iceberg. I want my kids back. This is unfair. I shouldn't have had my children taken from me. In IEP or education meetings, I want that one-on-one aid. The interest is what lies beneath, right? That's that emotional part. And oftentimes we ignore that. And when someone is in a heightened emotional state, if you were there on Monday for the trauma response, if someone's operating from the basement, right, like they're in this constant state of stress and trauma, it's very hard for them to get out of that. And as a facilitator or as a person that is actively listening to them, you can help them do that by acknowledging, yes, you want that, and you want that because your kids are super important to you. You really love your kids. I know you're trying. Something along those lines, right? And once you acknowledge those emotions, sometimes that immediately becomes easier to switch the position a little bit. So instead of, I want the one-on-one aid for my child, so they always have someone, a specific teacher with them in a classroom. Well, why do you want that? Maybe it's because you're scared for their safety. Maybe it's because something happened to you in a school. I have a case right now where that happened, where they don't want their kids in a public school because they had a bad experience at a public school. It started out as, no, they can't go to school. They can't go to school. They can't go to school. Once we got to the bottom of the safety aspect, now we're enrolling them in a public school by showing them how we're going to keep them safe. So we got to those interests, that bottom part of the iceberg, and by acknowledging the emotion and the fear there, and then helping them see a solution to alleviate that fear outside of their one position, then we were able to move forward. Questions about that? Okay. So again, the position is a possible solution, oftentimes seen as the only way, versus the why they want that. What causes that solution to be the only way? And the interests really are that emotion part of the conflict. So uncovering and understanding interests or those emotions is the key to working through conflict. So the rest of the presentation, we're going to talk about conflict styles and specific difficult personality conflict styles. In all of them, whether they're really, really kind of heightened or maybe even sometimes confrontational styles or styles where people are just shutting down, no matter what end of the spectrum, getting to those interests and understanding those emotions is the key to being able to move forward and work through conflict, and even in the future to preventing it. If you know what someone's core emotions are and the things that they're most worried about, sometimes that can even help you prevent a conflict in the future. Okay. So then the final kind of skill I want to talk about before diving into the difficult conversations and the difficult dynamics in a conflict is talking about giving feedback. So oftentimes, at least in my cases, as the quote unquote unbiased party, I'm not DFS, I'm not the parent, I'm like in the middle, right? I'm doing my own investigation. The attorney will ask me in court, well, what is your perspective on this, right? When giving feedback, especially about how a parent is doing on a case plan, for example, it's very important that you use this. This is RISK. I'm not a huge fan of acronyms, but some people like them, so I'm putting them in here anyway. So RISK is reporting the facts and stating the impact. That's just like the assertive speaking, not doing the dishes. I'm feeling upset about that because I then have to take extra time to do your chores for you. Same thing in court, although with probably more heightened emotions. Report the facts on they have or they haven't done what part of their case plan. How does that impact, relate it right back to the kiddos and the parenting? How would that positively or negatively impact the kids in the future? Specify what you prefer. Sometimes this isn't possible, but whenever possible, when discussing a case plan, especially in the beginning, if something is missing, if you think something in the case plan doesn't make sense or isn't fully thought out, specify an alternative versus just saying no, that doesn't work. What else would you like instead? And then stating the consequences. I think this is especially important in our CASA cases with kids. Sometimes I feel like the kids get left out of the courtroom a little bit, especially when they're younger, maybe not able to be in court. You're really the only one there that's constantly going to be bringing it back to the kid, right? So everything we're talking about in court, what impact and what consequence, positive or negative, does all the things we're talking about in court have on that child? And consistently bringing that up whenever you have the opportunity to testify, or even just whispering to your attorney so that they can bring that up for you, is extremely important, because a court case is, a long proceeding, potentially years. I've had cases that go on, drag out for years. Constantly bring that back up. And I think that gets lost in translation. So this is Rosie, sorry. Using this risk, report the facts, state the impact, specify a better alternative or your preference, and then stating the consequences will, again, just remind you to continue to bring it back to the kiddo. I use this at work also, like in my day job. I use this with my boss, kind of managing up a little bit. So when he sometimes takes a really long time to reply, this is the type of response I would give him. Again, not just saying like, I hate when you do this, or when I am supervising a grad student, you're not doing well. It's a different way to look at a compliment sandwich, which I'm not a fan of, where you state a good thing, then the constructive criticism, and then a good thing again. I think this risk is a much more honest way of giving feedback, but in a very respectful way. When you're receiving feedback, I struggle.
Can I ask you a question just about that?
Yep.
Yeah. So and I'm not judging, but your response seems really intense to send to a boss. Mm-hmm. I mean, is there a way to say, it made me late filing report and showed some inefficiencies from us, or going forward, is it possible for you to, because I'm not criticizing, but I'm like a career coach, and that's a very, I'm sorry. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it depends on what your relationship is, right?
Yeah.
With your boss. So my boss he doesn't want the fluff. He's like, just tell me how it is, right? If I was talking with someone that I maybe didn't have that relationship with, I would say I would probably use more of a compliment sandwich, honestly. Like, I know you're extremely busy. Right. If there's something I can help with to take off your plate, I'm happy to do so. I was not able to get the report in on time because I didn't have X data. How can we work together to make sure this doesn't happen in the future? Same thing of reporting the facts, stating the impact, specifying what you prefer, but probably a little softer on the
and just the win at the end, because as a result of that, we can do X. We'll get this in faster. We'll get the money back. Just yep. Kind of like the win to okay. But that's all. Sorry.
Nope, that's no problem. Good point. Other questions, thoughts? Okay. So when receiving feedback, I sometimes personally will get defensive and start thinking of ways that they're wrong. So I often need to pause. I know, again, another acronym. And this goes to the summary, where I talked about a skill before of summarizing. So it helps me to paraphrase and summarize what I have heard, because oftentimes I'm taking things and making them more personal than they are. So paraphrase what you heard, ask how you can do it better, what they would prefer, especially if they haven't specified that. But most importantly, actually pause, use time to think about it. Especially if you're a more emotional responder. I am a more emotional person. I take things personally sometimes. Making sure you're using some time to just sit in silence, or I sometimes just need to even walk away for a little bit and letting someone know, like, I'm gonna thank you for giving that feedback. I need to think about it for a little bit, and I'll follow up if I have questions. But making sure it's still timely when you do follow up. So don't wait, 2 months to bring it back up. But if you do need a day or some hours to think about things, make sure you take them. Obviously, that wouldn't work if they're asking you a specific question in court and you're testifying. but oftentimes it can be nerve-wracking to testify. So I still use this where my time to cool down before responding is actually asking them, I hear you asking this. Is that what you're actually looking for? Is that the question you actually want me to answer? And that actually stalls a little bit and gives me extra time to think through how I want to respond to that. And again, summarizing is the important facts you heard, but then also, especially when talking with a parent, the first or second time I talk with a parent, it's very emotional, and acknowledging those emotions is a part of paraphrasing and summarizing. If they're using a word like pissed or angry, use that word back. Say, I hear you're really pissed off. Don't, I wouldn't repeat any kind of like vulgar language, but if they're using pissed off, I say, I hear you're pissed off and this is why. Is there anything else that you want to share with me? Did I get that right? Because oftentimes at that point, when you're talking with the parent, they've potentially told that story a lot of times, but very few times do they feel like they're being heard, because the process just keeps moving and they sometimes don't even know what the process is. So taking the time to stop, paraphrase or summarize back to them the story that they're telling, and then move on with your questions from there, but really giving them the time to share their part of the story and summarizing it for them. Oftentimes for me, even if it ends up in termination of parental rights, those parents respect me because I've been able to give them the time and they know I've actually heard them versus just ignored them and plowed on. So now we're going to go into the styles. There's a lot of different conflict styles, but they distill down into 5 specific styles. So I'm going to just throw up the 5 right now, and I am going to ask you to share what you think, without going into detail of what they each are, where you think you fall on, generally speaking, what style do you default to? So there's collaborating, avoiding, competing, accommodating, and compromising. So these are the 5 conflict styles. So when I told you I'm a people pleaser. So generally, if I don't think about something too hard, I will default to accommodating personally. Anyone else want to share where they think they default to? And I'll ask you again after we go over them in a little bit more detail, but where you think you are in terms of conflict. What do you like to do with conflict?
Davis, I
I
would
think
say
for me,
compromising.
Yeah, compromising.
Compromising?
Yeah. The reason for compromising is to find out how we can work this out. What can each party give?
Yep. Collaborative, I see. Avoiding, collaborative, avoiding or accommodating. That goes together a lot. Yes.
for me, it really
Compromising.
depends on my emotion at the time, or how I'm dealing with the day. I like to think that in most cases, especially in the business world, I'm in the collaborating, but if you catch me on a bad day, I may exhibit some avoidance or even competing. It
Yeah.
just depends on my emotions at the time.
Absolutely. And that's super important to recognize, kind of going back to the beginning of being able to look in the mirror and be like, okay, where am I today? I'm going to have this big team meeting potentially with all these people from my CASA case. Where am I at before even stepping foot into that meeting is super important. So collaborator, I heard some of you say that you're collaborators. So this is cooperating with others to find a solution that addresses the concerns of both the parties. So collaborator and compromiser kind of get confused sometimes. A collaborator is a win-win situation. So collaborating isn't always possible, right? If we look at a CASA case, there's only a set number of goals, right? Outcomes that we can have as a part of a CASA case: reunification, TPR, APLA. If someone says, I want reunification, and someone says, I want TPR, you can't collaborate on a win-win in that situation, right? One of those things is going to win. But when possible, collaborating is great. It's not always possible, though. Then there's the compromiser. This is similar, where you're identifying solutions that both parties can live with. And we heard that, I think it was Sheila, yes, that said, like, how can we both work this out? How can we get to a point where we both can live with the solution? Even if we both don't get everything we want, we've made some progress. This is typically where we want to be as CASAs, right? Compromiser. Not always, right? We want to hear all parties, but sometimes it's not possible to work with the parent. Sometimes they're really not doing what they need to do. But this is extremely important, even just thinking about your personal life. If the relationship is super important to you, it's going to be super important that you compromise whenever possible, because you need to coexist, whether it's a boss employee situation or a sibling situation. This is extremely important when the relationship that of who's in conflict is extremely important. Then there's the accommodator. This is where I tend to default especially if I'm exhausted. So you're neglecting your personal concerns because you just want you want to deal with the conflict and make it go away, but you're not really making it go away in a sustainable way for you, right? Because eventually you're not going to be fine with it. You see all the memes about, when a woman says she's fine, she's probably not, and you should get worried. This is kind of that, right? But you don't necessarily want to deal with the full ramifications of the conflict. You might accommodate. The thing about, I'm going to pause on accommodator because there are some difficult personalities that default to accommodator that you'll see especially in team meetings, that it's important that you address. So these are passive people. And sometimes you don't think of passive people as super difficult, as difficult personalities. I think they're the most difficult to deal with. 2 examples of those personalities, and one of the handouts has all of these like clam, indecisive, staller things in it. So an indecisive staller is someone that, especially when it's a heightened emotional state and it's an extremely important decision, they won't make the decision. They won't give you anything. That is extremely frustrating when you're having to make a decision in a CASA case for court, in an education best interest meeting. If you have someone that's indecisive, it's extremely difficult. Similarly with clams, this is someone that just like goes into themselves and won't say anything. I see this a lot in really heightened emotional states when people are just not about it. They might clam up. They definitely have opinions about it, but they aren't sharing them. So for these passive people, that might just be like, whatever you want, it's extremely important to ask them open-ended questions and sit in silence and be comfortable with that silence until they respond. Even if they only say a few words, you can listen for some indirect words or specific places that they're hesitating to provide you with clues to where they're stuck. So for example, if you're in an education meeting or you're in a case planning meeting with a parent and they all of a sudden clam up and aren't responding when they were before around a certain issue, there's probably something about that issue that concerns them. It could just be that they don't understand what you're talking about because you're using a lot of acronyms or words that they're not familiar with, or it could be that they are insecure about the knowledge of that area. But even if they're not saying something and they become very passive on a certain point, that tells you a lot of information. If they're still not giving you anything, propose a plan and ask them for help. Oftentimes, passive people, especially if they're accommodators, they want to help you, right? So if you ask them for help, sometimes that gets them talking a little bit more. Like, I really don't understand this, or I really don't know what to do, and I need your help with this. Again, asking those open-ended questions about what they think is extremely important, and bringing it back to something. In CASA cases, hopefully you have some kind of relationship with the people you're dealing with, biological, foster parents, teachers, DFS caseworkers. Bring it back to the end goal, right? The kid. Everyone in that case, in theory, should be caring about that child. So what do you think would be best for Johnny? How do we move forward so that Johnny can be the most successful? That will sometimes help them get out of that passive funk. And sometimes it's also helpful, especially if you're in a larger group team meeting, is talking with them one-on-one. If you know that someone is more passive and more quiet when you've historically been in meetings, try and talk to them ahead of time one-on-one and see if you can help them even practice for what they are going to say and what they want to bring forward. Questions about that? So we're going to move into competitor. I think a lot of times when people see competitor, there's a lot of negative connotations that come with that potentially. That's not always, competing is not always bad. Sometimes you're using your formal authority or power to satisfy a deadline, something that needs to be done. However, competitors can sometimes be off-putting and get that negative connotation if you're not really caring about the concerns of everyone else in the room. So I think it's important when you're dealing with a competitor to understand where the competitiveness is coming from. Is it like what Carmen, I think, said this, Carmine said, depending on the day and where I am emotionally, I might compete. So if you're in a meeting with someone that's not normally that way, maybe we need to take a step back and again get to that under the iceberg, what's going on there. But there's a lot of different difficult personalities that I think scare people the most when you have an aggressive or potentially hostile person in a meeting or someone in a one-on-one that you're talking to. And these are the three that come to mind most for me. So the Sherman tanks are just, they're in it. Like, they are using their power in a kind of inappropriate way, right? They're standing up, everyone's sitting down. They will just keep talking. They sometimes don't even know what they're talking about, but they want to make sure that you hear them and they get the last word. An exploder is different. An exploder is someone that just like freaks out at very specific moments. And when I say freaks out, I mean it's loud. It can be shocking. But these are the folks that sometimes are in that trauma response, that it's the last straw, and it might not be the thing at the base of the iceberg that's really making them upset, but they're exploding in that meeting. And then a sniper is someone that's typically pretty quiet and actually might come across as passive. And then all of a sudden there's like a zinger, is what I call it, where it's kind of like a backhanded compliment that isn't actually a compliment, or someone that out of nowhere is questioning someone and their knowledge or their ability or their ethics. So this is someone that just out of nowhere is just trying to throw you off your game. If you're dealing with an aggressive or a hostile person, it's imperative that you use that assertive speaking, using those I statements, making sure that you're standing up for your position. But again, trying to take the emotion out of it as much as possible. You still acknowledge emotions, but you're separating the issue from the person as much as possible. So instead of saying you are unprofessional, you can say something along the lines of, I'm not feeling respected. Again, using those I statements versus going after someone and their personality. Asking very direct questions. So instead of arguing back and forth, asking, tell me more about that. Can you explain more about why that's the big thing that you want? If you know you're going to be in a meeting or a one-on-one conversation with someone like this that often yells, I always start a conversation. I had a parent one time, it was a foster parent actually, who constantly berated me. And after a while, every time I would call her, I would say, hi, let's say Miss Smith, want to, give you an update and talk about where we are in the case and get an update on Johnny. However, I want to make sure that our conversation is respectful. So if we start yelling, if either of us starts yelling, I think both of us should have the opportunity to step back from the conversation, because it's not going to be productive. Or I am going to, in a meeting with a lot of people, sometimes people get up and start yelling or pointing. I say at the beginning, I think it's really important that we all stay on the same level, being seated, so that there's not, unbalanced power with regards to our bodies. And being very clear about that ahead of time and making sure folks know, like, if we can't have that conversation, I'm not going to be able to continue. I think especially for me, when I was having, especially with that one foster parent, and that still didn't work sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. I just went to my coordinator, and eventually we had to come to the decision that I wouldn't be communicating with that person anymore. And it actually ended up as a red flag for DFS because other folks were coming forward with concerns, and then they ended up doing an investigation. So I think it's also important when you're dealing with these types of personalities, especially if you're uncomfortable, being in communication with your coordinator to make sure that your safety obviously is number one, but maybe that also raises some red flags about other things going on in that person's life that maybe they're not in a position to be a foster parent in that case at that point in time. And then finally, I still think it's important that you give someone that might be aggressive or coming off as hostile a time to speak, still using that paraphrasing and summarizing, because sometimes if someone comes in like that, especially if they're the Sherman tanks, right, like immediately they're right up in your face, they're telling you everything, maybe it's a raised voice, sometimes it's not at you, it's just that's the situation. So being able to sit there for a little bit and let them go on, maybe summarizing it back to them, that will diffuse how they're feeling, because they finally feel heard. They finally heard someone tell them what they've been saying. Oh, you actually heard me? Oh, okay. I can sit down and we can talk more about this. Questions about that? Okay. So again, I'm going to bring up speaking assertively, thinking before you speak, saying what you mean, meaning what you say, but separating the feelings and reactions from attaching a negative connotation to that person forever. So if someone has a bad day, right? I've had bad days. I really hope the people that I interacted with in those days don't think that's the only Leann there is. So making sure, especially with biological parents, especially at the beginning of a case, that you're able to diffuse the situation as much as possible, and really make sure they feel heard, but that you're not being the doormat that's like, oh yeah, you're absolutely right. You don't want to commit yourself, because they might then twist that and say, oh yeah, the Casa Leann agreed with me, so the DFS worker's terrible, and she said the DFS worker was awful too. You don't want to get in that situation. So using that how you feel or what you believe is extremely important, and standing up for yourself at the same time will be helpful in diffusing the situation, and still gaining that trust with the other party. Another type of competitor are these stubborn folks. So bulldozers are my favorite to deal with, because these are the people that they don't necessarily talk forever, but they'll be like, this is the way we're going to do it. I have the decision making. So this is what we're going to do. And that's it. And then they just sit back and they're like, nope, I'm not going to listen to anything else. I've had a DFS worker like this. Sometimes that's just because they're so overwhelmed, they can't think of anything else but that solution. But bulldozers oftentimes are very knowledgeable, right? They know and have played out in their head every different which way things can go, and they've decided this is the best way. On the other end, there's the balloons, who are people pleasers also, but instead of being the accommodating, they want people to think they're the smartest person in the room, even though they might not know what they're talking about. So they just kind of talk in circles until they get to the point they want to make, and then that's the point, and then that's it. So they kind of like blow themselves up to get to a point where this is what we're going to do, but they don't actually have a lot of knowledge to back it up. So the bulldozers do, but are giving no room, and the balloons don't and are giving no room. So the best way to deal with those stubborn, this is the only way people, is helping them to consider alternate views without directly challenging their self-image or their expertise. So again, acknowledging their competence, and saying like, I see you've really thought about this. I know you've dealt with this before. Sometimes talking with them one-on-one and in private versus challenging them consistently, or disagreeing with them in a team meeting is helpful. And asking questions in a way, using assertive speaking, to help them, again, see those alternative points of view. So doesn't always work, but sometimes with a DFS worker, this is the case plan. This is the only way to go. We're not putting anything else in. Well, could we play out what it would be like if we added parenting classes? Could we play out what it would look like if we added a family interventionist? Well, we can't add a family interventionist because there aren't any right now. There aren't any available. Okay, so it's not really that you don't want a family interventionist. It's because you think it's impossible to get one. So that it just takes the conversation in a different way. Again, getting to the interests versus the position. So asking those questions, helping them consider alternative views. And sometimes it's, self-deprecating to a point where you're like, can you help me understand why we wouldn't put this in? I know you've done this a lot before, Jane, the DFS worker. Can you help me understand why it would be this goal versus this goal? And allowing them to share their expertise. Sometimes they talk themselves into something, and they think it's their idea, and that helps them move forward. Questions about stubborn? Okay. And then we have the avoider. So there's no conflict at all. There's nothing. Nothing's happening. They take no action whatsoever. So again, it's not just that, yeah, you can have whatever you want. Clams can sometimes be avoiders. It's sometimes clams literally have no opinion and they're just ignoring it. That is really challenging. Sometimes an avoider can also be really negative, right? So they complain about something completely separate from the issue that we're talking about. I love this scene from Parks and Rec where they are having a town hall about like building a new park, and this lady is just talking about a sandwich that was there, not actually about like how to build the new park. So sometimes I'm in meetings. A lot of times it happens in education meetings where we're talking about an IEP for speech language pathology, for example, a speech goal, but they want to talk about transportation. It's still important to deal with that, but we're here for this, right? Or the negativist is similar to the complainer, but the negativist is focusing on the problem and just saying, that'll never work, that'll never work, that'll never work. But not coming up with any other solutions. So if you're dealing with a pessimist, you have to break that negative cycle. So you have to focus on the facts. So if they're complaining about something that isn't relevant, bring them back, right? What are we here for? Say, yes, we will deal with that, but we will deal with that after this meeting, or we will deal with that. The right people aren't in the room. Breaking that cycle is extremely important. Asking them just like, what would it take to make you completely happy? Maybe no one's ever asked them that before. But the key here is not to dismiss them of, oh, that's just negative Nancy. That's just, you know, pessimistic Peggy. Like, we're not, it's fine. Just ignore her. It's really important that you still use those summary skills, those paraphrasing skills. And then after you paraphrase, instead of saying, did I get it right? Or is there anything else? Because you don't want them to go back into the negative narrative cycle. Say, okay, so you said all of these things. I've heard you say all of these things. In a perfect world, let's say we have a perfect world. Could you see XYZ working? Would you be willing to XYZ and give them an alternative? Again, some of the times you're just dealing with a person that is never going to get out of that cycle. But by using these skills to the best of your ability, it oftentimes will help them get out of the cycle, especially if they have never been asked before. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen real quick because I saw something in the chat. You have a new case where a mother hangs up on you. If you're able to come off mute, can you tell us a little bit more about, does she talk a little bit and then hangs up on you, or just automatically hangs up on you?
Well, so she's very mad at DFS, and she'd actually given her child to call DFS, to take her child because her child was having a lot of behavioral problems, and she thought, DFS would act right away, but it took some time for DFS to get a PBH approval and all that. So anyway, she's very mad at the whole system, and so when I call her to find out, I was asked by my CASA coordinator to find out, like, just to get her side of things. She just hung up on me. Initially, I thought maybe she just hit, disconnected, but then she did it again. So
she picks up but doesn't say anything and then hangs up?
No, as soon as she knows that it's me, she hangs up.
Interesting. Okay. And you just have the phone number for her, not an email? Do you know if she can text, anything like that?
I have a phone number for her, but I didn't want to go beyond calling, so go beyond text, like go to texting or anything like that.
Okay. And does she have a voicemail set up?
I'm not sure because she's picked up the last couple of times.
Okay, I see. So I would keep trying, right? But instead of starting with, hey, it's the CASA, right? Start with, I'm an advocate, and I would like to talk to you about how we can resolve your concerns, and make it about her, right? Like, I want to hear your concerns, why you're upset, and what it would take to get you out of that being upset. However, if she still keeps hanging up, you don't have a chance to leave a voicemail, and you have no way to put that in writing, just, if you've tried several times, that just might be what it is. If you can catch her, are your cases in person, your court cases in person?
Yeah.
Has she come in person?
We have had the adjudicatory hearing so far, and it didn't go well for her at all. So she's unhappy.
Okay. Sometimes I find it helpful to try and catch them before or after and use that same language. Like, that was really tough. I know I'm sure you're feeling, or I can only imagine how you're feeling. Would you be willing to sit down and talk to me about ways that we can work together to resolve this? I'd love to hear out what you've been through and hear your perspective on that. I haven't really been able to hear your side of the story yet. And again, making it about her to try and build some of that rapport. But if they don't even give you the opportunity, like, you can have all the skills in the world, but if someone's never going to give you the opportunity, that's a them, not a you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Can I add something on that?
Yeah.
I'm Jess Hazard. I'm one of the CASA coordinators. I'm out of Kent. I'm just putting this out here, but I had a CASA that didn't contact the parents. We were still in reunification. Dad was somewhat engaged, and he would fall off. Then he would engage again, then he would fall off. And Judge Hayes in Sussex County directly asked my CASA when the last time she had contacted Dad. I had advised her twice between the hearings to contact him. She chose not to. And Judge Hayes actually asked her directly. So when we're in reunification, we have to make that our duty to contact them. And it can be something as simple as, hey, this is your CASA, or this is the CASA for the kids. I'm just trying to reach out. But at least you have that paper log.
Yeah.
So we don't go into the court and they say we're not doing our job. The other thing I just want to throw out here is it's not personal. They're going through some stuff. I was a FI previously in my previous life, and I will tell you, I've been cussed out by all of them. So
Yeah.
It's not a personal thing. You're there to help, and goodness, we appreciate it, but just don't take it personally. They hate the system. And if you're coming and they think you're the system, so, keep trying. And even if it's just a text, because nobody answers phone calls anymore either. That's the other thing, right? I look at phone number if I'm like, nope.
Yep.
Maybe leave a voicemail. So just my 2 cents, but I just wanted to throw that out there. I see some of my Sussex folks on here too. But I had one that got kind of called out, and I don't ever want that to ever happen again to any of our people. So
yeah.
I had this is Joyce. Can you hear me? I had a parent that did not want to communicate with me either. And so I stopped communicating with her in terms of making phone calls to her and trying to follow up. But what I started to do is go to the parent to observe the parent meetings with the child. And maybe at the end of it, when the parent and the child had finished their visit, I would pull her, she's ready to leave. I would pull her aside and maybe just ask her a question and ask her, is there anything I can do to help you? Or even just asking her questions, where she's at in terms of doing things on her plan, just to have that communication. And over time, I think just by me continually to going to those meetings and just observing, she kind of started feeling a little bit more like I was really concerned about her child a lot. And she really appreciated that and started, I still don't have one-on-one contact with her. But the last meeting I had, she asked me to send her something. I said, oh, well, I don't even know if I have your correct number. Can you give me your number? And then I will send this thing on to you. So, I just had to keep trying, I guess. That's what you're saying. Keep trying, because it is our job to keep communication open.
Absolutely. So I apologize. I talked a long time. I've done 4-hour trainings on this, so I was trying to give you as much information as possible. My recommendation is the handout that's about difficult personality styles. That is going to be helpful. It has a column about like the Sherman tanks, what they do, how you might feel in reaction to those, and then some tips and tricks for each specific one. So feel free to use that. If you're interested in more intense training on facilitation or mediation, happy to help connect you to some of those like more intense. So a basic mediation training to become a full-fledged mediator is usually about 2 weeks of training, similar amount of hours to becoming a CASA. If you're interested in any of those, I'm happy to chat with you, but I thank you so much for listening to me. I hope you've got at least a nugget of something, and I'm always willing to hear feedback. So I'd love to hear what you have to say. I know Lauren will send out an evaluation.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Leann, that was so awesome. Thank you so much. Everybody, yes, I'm going to send the 3 documents that Leann emailed me. I'm going to include them in my email that I'm going to send right in just another second or two. That also has an evaluation. Please take a moment and fill that out. That really helps me gauge and kind of make some future adjustments to Lunch and Learns. So stand by for that email. And thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.